In the autumn of 1777, the American Revolution appeared to be losing in the place that mattered most. British troops entered Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress. Washington had been beaten at Brandywine, checked again at Germantown, and forced toward winter quarters. From the outside, Britain seemed to be winning. Yet hundreds of miles to the north, another British army was running out of road, food, and time. When that army surrendered at Saratoga, the victory did more than save New York. It convinced France that the rebellion might survive. Then, while diplomats in Paris prepared an alliance, Washington's exhausted soldiers entered Valley Forge. The revolution lost its capital, gained a great power ally, and began rebuilding its army, all in the same turning season. How did a year that looked like an American defeat transform the rebellion into a stronger military and international threat? Why did the capture of Philadelphia fail to break the cause, while the surrender of one British army in northern New York persuaded France to risk a wider war? By 1777, Britain no longer faced a protest movement that could be dispersed by one show of force. The colonies had declared independence, formed a continental army, and survived the disasters of the previous year. But survival was not victory. Britain still controlled the sea, occupied New York, and possessed professional troops capable of striking almost anywhere along the coast. London's answer was a campaign designed to break the rebellion politically and geographically. One British army would take Philadelphia, the symbolic center of American government. Another would move south from Canada toward Albany, separating New England from the middle colonies. On paper, the two operations promised pressure from different directions. In practice, they became two campaigns with different priorities, different supply problems, and almost no ability to support each other. General William Howe commanded the main British army around New York. He was experienced, cautious about costly frontal assaults, and convinced that capturing major political centers could weaken the rebellion's will. His objective was Philadelphia. Far to the north, General John Burgoyne commanded a separate force advancing from Canada. Burgoyne believed that a disciplined army moving down the Lake Champlain and Hudson corridor could cut New England away from the rest of the colonies. His plan depended on movement, cooperation, and a long supply line through difficult country. The Americans faced the two threats with different commanders and different methods. Washington tried to shield Philadelphia while keeping his army intact. In the north, Philip Schuyler, Horatio Gates, Benedict Arnold, Daniel Morgan, and thousands of regulars and militia worked to slow, surround, and exhaust Burgoyne. The year would not be decided by one commander defeating another. It would be decided by which side could connect strategy, terrain, supply, and political effect. The geography of the two campaigns could not have been more different. Howe used the Royal Navy to move around the American coast, landing near the Chesapeake and approaching Philadelphia from the south. Roads, rivers, and fords shaped Washington's defensive choices, but British naval mobility allowed Howe to choose where the campaign began. Burgoyne had no such freedom. His army advanced through a narrow corridor of lakes, forests, rivers, and rough roads. Every mile south increased the distance from Canada. Supplies had to move behind the army through country the Americans could obstruct. Trees could be felled across roads. Bridges could be destroyed. Low ground could be flooded. What looked like open space on a map became a chain of delays on the ground. Howe intended to defeat Washington, capture Philadelphia, and create the impression that the rebellion's government could not protect itself. Washington hoped to block the approach, avoid destruction, and preserve enough strength to strike again. Burgoyne's design was more ambitious. He expected to advance toward Albany while another British force moved through the Mohawk Valley and support arrived from the south. If the movements joined, New England might be isolated. The Americans in the north did not need to destroy Burgoyne immediately. They needed to slow him. Every delayed wagon, every lost foraging party, and every militia unit gathering ahead of him made his position worse. The British plan required connection. The American response was to turn distance into separation. On September 11, 1777, Washington attempted to stop Howe at Brandywine Creek. The American line covered several crossings, but British troops found a route upstream and turned Washington's right flank. The movement echoed earlier defeats, pressure in front, danger arriving from a direction the defense had not secured. The Continental Army fought, withdrew, and survived, but the road to Philadelphia opened. Washington tried again at Germantown in early October. This time the Americans attacked. The plan was bold, with several columns moving through darkness toward the British position. For a moment, the assault created real confusion. Then fog, difficult coordination, and friendly fire broke the momentum. Units lost contact. Orders became uncertain. The attack stalled, and the Americans withdrew. The British occupied Philadelphia. Congress had already moved away. Howe had captured the political capital and won the campaign's most visible prize. But he had not destroyed Washington's army, and he was now operating far from the northern campaign that needed support. Philadelphia mattered, but its capture did not end the revolution. The Continental Congress could meet elsewhere. State governments continued to function. Washington's army remained in the field. This exposed a central weakness in British strategy. Taking an American city created headlines, but it did not automatically produce control of the countryside or the collapse of armed resistance. Howe had won ground without eliminating the force that made the rebellion dangerous. More importantly, his movement toward Philadelphia did nothing to solve Burgoyne's growing crisis. Britain was winning one campaign in a way that could not rescue the other. Burgoyne began with success. Fort Ticonderoga fell in July, shocking the Americans and clearing the northern gateway. But the speed of the advance soon disappeared. American forces withdrew while destroying roads, blocking routes, and forcing the British to repair every mile of progress. Burgoyne's army carried artillery, baggage, animals, and supplies through terrain that resisted organized movement. The farther he advanced, the more vulnerable his rear became. A British expedition moving through the Mohawk Valley failed to reach him. At Bennington, a force sent to gather horses and supplies was defeated by American militia. The loss was more than tactical. Burgoyne had spent men he could not replace and failed to obtain the resources he needed. Meanwhile, American strength increased. Militia arrived because the threat was moving closer to their homes. Riflemen under Daniel Morgan added accurate skirmishing power. Defensive positions near the Hudson narrowed Burgoyne's choices. His army had entered the corridor expecting reinforcement and cooperation. Instead, every route around it was becoming more hostile. The struggle near Saratoga unfolded in two major engagements. At Freeman's Farm in September, the British held the field, but the fighting cost them heavily. A tactical success became a strategic warning. Burgoyne could not afford equal losses. The Americans could. By early October, his supplies were falling, his promised support had not arrived, and the American army in front of him was stronger than before. On October 7th, Burgoyne launched another effort near Bemis Heights. The attack failed. American units counterattacked, pressing the British back toward their defenses. Benedict Arnold, despite conflict with Horatio Gates, entered the fighting at a critical moment and helped drive the assault forward. Burgoyne attempted to retreat, but the roads north were threatened, and his army was surrounded. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered nearly 6,000 troops. The surrender did not erase the loss of Philadelphia. It changed the meaning of the entire year. Britain had captured a city. The Americans had captured an army. Saratoga mattered because military results are not measured only by ground. The victory showed that the Continental forces could stop and compel the surrender of a major British army. That was evidence foreign governments could use. France had already supplied the Americans secretly, but open alliance carried far greater risk. Before Saratoga, French leaders could still fear that the rebellion would collapse and leave France exposed. After Saratoga, the Americans looked less like a temporary disturbance and more like a force capable of sustaining war. The victory converted battlefield endurance into diplomatic credibility. That was its deepest strategic effect. News of Saratoga reached Paris while Benjamin Franklin and other American representatives were pressing for formal recognition. France did not enter the war because it suddenly embraced Republican equality. It entered because weakening Britain served French interests, and Saratoga suggested the opportunity was real. In February 1778, France recognized American independence and signed treaties of commerce and alliance. The conflict was no longer only a British attempt to suppress 13 colonies. It was becoming a global war involving fleets, imperial possessions, and competing European powers. Yet the alliance was signed while Washington's soldiers were suffering at Valley Forge. The Army entered winter quarters in December 1777 with inadequate clothing, unreliable food, and a supply system close to breakdown. Disease moved through crowded huts. Men deserted. Horses died. The political promise of French intervention existed far away. The immediate reality was hunger, cold, and administrative failure. But Valley Forge was not only a story of suffering. Nathaniel Greene began improving the quartermaster system. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived in February and introduced standardized drill, camp organization, and common methods of maneuver. He trained a model company, then spread those practices across the Army. The same winter that exposed the Army's weakness also began turning experience into institution. The Continental Army had survived earlier campaigns through endurance, local knowledge, and the refusal to disappear. Those qualities were essential, but they were not enough for a long war. Valley Forge mattered because it made the Army more repeatable. Units began using shared procedures. Officers could expect similar movements from different regiments. Camp sanitation and supply received greater attention. Training became less dependent on the customs of individual colonies. Saratoga gave the Revolution an ally. Valley Forge gave it a more coherent army. One changed the balance outside America. The other changed the force inside it. When the Army left Valley Forge in June 1778, Britain still held New York, and the war remained far from over. But the strategic environment had changed. France now threatened Britain at sea and across its empire. American forces had gained confidence from Saratoga and greater discipline from the winter reforms. At Monmouth, Washington's troops fought the British in intense heat and remained on the field. The battle was not a decisive American victory, but it demonstrated that the Continental Army could now endure a sustained engagement without dissolving, and proof that Britain could lose more than territory. The turning point of 1777 was not one clean victory. Philadelphia fell. Washington was beaten. Valley Forge became a place of hunger and disease. But Burgoyne's army surrendered. France entered the war, and the Continental Army began becoming an institution rather than a temporary collection of regiments. Britain won the capital and lost the strategic year. That is the deeper lesson of Saratoga and Valley Forge. A war can turn not when one side appears strongest, but when separate events, battlefield pressure, diplomatic opportunity, and institutional reform finally begin working together.